Chapter 26, The Triumph of Conservatism, 1969 to 1988, Parts 1 through 3. Part 1. The 1960s saw contesting ideals of freedom, most notably between civil rights and the burgeoning conservative movement. Republican Senator Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign for the presidency helped spread ideas that later defined conservatism, such as opposition to the welfare state and a reduction in taxes and government regulations. Goldwater showed that whenever liberals controlled Washington, conservatives could portray themselves as anti-government populists, broadening their base and ending their image as upper-class elites. The late 1960s and the 1970s saw developments that transformed American politics. The disintegration of the New Deal coalition forged by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, an economic crisis that liberal policies could not end, a shift of population and economic resources to conservative bastions in the South and West, the growth of an activist conservative Christianity more and more aligned with the Republican Party, and a series of U.S. defeats overseas. Together, these events expanded the influence of conservatives' ideas, including their definition of freedom. In the post-World War II era, conservatism seemed marginal in a very liberal environment. Conservatism was seen as outdated and associated with conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, and preferences for social hierarchy over equality. Liberals believed conservatives were simply alienated or psychologically disturbed. In the 1950s and 60s, conservatism was reborn. In 1968, a backlash of formerly Democratic voters against black protest and the anti-war movement helped Richard Nixon win the White House. But conservatives were dissatisfied with Nixon. Nixon adopted conservative language, but actually expanded the welfare state and improved relations with the Soviets and China. Nixon, who won by a thin margin, moved to the center, trying to solidify Republican support and win disaffected Democrats. Nixon, most interested in foreign policy and wanting to avoid fights with the Democratic Congress over domestic policy, actually accepted and expanded much of the Great Society and welfare state. Nixon established new federal regulatory agencies, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board, all of which limited entrepreneurial freedoms. Nixon spent liberally on social services and environmental initiatives. He abolished the Office of Economic Opportunity, which had coordinated the war on poverty, but he also expanded food stamps and tied Social Security benefits to inflation. The Endangered Species and Clean Air Acts regulated businesses in order to limit pollution and protect animals threatened with extinction. Nixon's great surprise was his proposal for a family assistance plan to replace aid to families with dependent children, the AFDC. Under his plan, the federal government would guarantee a minimum income for all Americans. AFDC, known as welfare, gave aid, usually quite limited, to poor families who met local eligibility requirements. Originally a New Deal program that helped mostly the white poor, welfare came to be associated with blacks, who by 1970 were half of all welfare recipients. AFDC roles expanded in the 1960s partly because of relaxed federal eligibility standards. Conservative politicians now attacked welfare recipients as people who wanted to live off honest taxpayers rather than work. But Nixon's plan for a guaranteed annual income, too radical for conservatives and not enough for liberals, did not pass Congress. Nixon's racial policy was ambiguous. He nominated conservative Southern jurists who favored segregation to the Supreme Court to win over the white South, but the Senate rejected them. The courts lost patience with Southern delays in enforcing civil rights laws and finally forced Southern schools to desegregate. Briefly, Nixon also embraced affirmative action programs to raise minority employment. Nixon expanded Johnson's efforts to require federal contractors to hire minorities. But Nixon wanted the affirmative action program as a way to fight inflation by weakening the power of building trades unions. He believed their control over the labor market hiked wages to unreasonable levels and increased construction costs. He hoped the plan would cause tension between blacks and labor unions and that Republicans would benefit. Indeed, this is what happened. Trade unions of skilled construction workers, with few black members, strongly opposed Nixon's plan. Nixon hoped to win blue-collar workers over for the 1972 elections, and he quickly replaced his affirmative action plan with a program that did not require federal contractors to hire minorities. When Earl Warren retired as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1969, Nixon replaced him with Warren Burger, an opponent of the Warren Court's judicial activism. Burger was expected to lead the court in a conservative direction, but he surprised Nixon and others by initially expanding much of the Warren Court's jurisprudence. In 1971, the court approved plans to integrate Southern schools through busing, in which students were transported to other schools to make an integrated student body. Judges everywhere began to order busing, angering many white parents who wanted to keep their children in majority-white neighborhood schools. Particularly bitter and violent protests broke out in Boston. In only a few years, the court reversed itself and abandoned efforts to wrest control of local schools or bus students at great distances to achieve integration. Rulings absolved suburban districts of the responsibility of enrolling non-white and often poor students from non-suburban neighborhoods. By the 1990s, northern public schools were more segregated than southern public schools. Efforts to gain more job opportunities for minorities also sparked bitter legal battles and white resentments. Many whites came to see affirmative action programs as reverse discrimination that violated the 14th Amendment by giving non-whites special advantages over whites. As affirmative action spread from blacks to include women, Latinos, Asian, and Native Americans, conservatives demanded that the Supreme Court ban such programs. The Supreme Court refused, but offered no consistent position. But the court proved more and more hostile to government affirmative action programs. In 1978, the court shot down a University of California admissions program that set aside a quota of places for non-white medical students. The majority rejected the ideas of quotas while ruling that race could be one factor among many in college admissions. In the 1990s, affirmative action was ambiguously employed in higher education, although in 2003 the court reaffirmed that race could be a factor in college admissions. Alarming conservatives, the sexual revolution became mainstream in the 1970s. Premarital sex was more widely accepted. The number of divorces and age of marriage rose, and by 1975, more divorces occurred than first-time marriages. American birth rates dropped dramatically, the result of women's changing lives and the availability of birth control and legal abortion. In the Nixon years, sexual equality advanced in law and policy. In 1972, Congress approved Title IX, banning gender discrimination in higher education, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, requiring that married women have access to their own credit. Huge sexual discrimination suits against large employers worth millions of dollars were won in courts. The number of working women continued to rise. By 1980, 40% of women with children worked. In 1990, 55%. Working women had various motivations, from being a professional in careers traditionally limited to men to bolstering family income as the economy faltered. The gay and lesbian movement also expanded in the 1970s. By 1979, there were thousands of local gay rights groups through the country. They elected officials, pressed states to decriminalize homosexuality, and passed anti-discrimination laws in major cities. They urged gay men and lesbians to come out of the closet and forced the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. By the 1970s, the counterculture's emphasis on personal freedom and individuality had become mainstream. Americans became obsessed with self-improvement in fitness, diets, and psychological therapies. Conservatives also believed Nixon was soft in foreign policy. Certainly, Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, continued their predecessors' policies of trying to undermine governments that seemed to endanger U.S. strategic or economic interests. Nixon sent arms to pro-American dictators in Iran, the Philippines, and South Africa. When Chileans elected the socialist Salvador Allende president, the CIA helped his domestic opponents launch a coup on September 11, 1973, that overthrew and killed Allende and installed a bloody regime ruled by General Augusto Pinochet. Thousands of Allende's supporters, including some Americans, were tortured and murdered, while others fled the country. In relations with major communist countries, however, Nixon decreased Cold War tensions. Nixon launched his political career as a militant anti-communist, but he and Kissinger were realists. They were more interested in power than ideology and preferred stability to endless conflict. Nixon hoped that better relations with the Soviets would pressure North Vietnam to end the Vietnam War on terms acceptable to America. Nixon also realized that China had its own interests, separate from those of the Soviets, and would soon be a major world power. In early 1972, Nixon made a highly publicized trip to Beijing, which led to China finally occupying its seat in the United Nations. Although full diplomatic relations with China were not established until 1979, Nixon's visit sparked a vast trade increase between the United States and China. 3 months after his China trip, Nixon became the first president to visit the Soviet Union, where he negotiated with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. The talks led to increased trade and 2 landmark arms control treaties: the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, which capped each country's arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which banned the development of systems for intercepting income missiles. Nixon and Brezhnev declared a new age of peaceful coexistence in which détente, cooperation, would replace Cold War hostility. Chapter 26, Part 2. In his 1968 campaign, Nixon pledged that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Once in office, he declared a new policy, Vietnamization, in which U.S. troops would gradually be withdrawn while South Vietnamese troops, backed by U.S. bombing, would take up combat. But Vietnamization did not limit the war or the anti-war movement. In early 1970, Nixon ordered U.S. troops into neutral Cambodia in order to disrupt supply lines to the south. But the invasion did not achieve its military goals, and it destabilized the Cambodian government, starting a chain of events that brought the Khmer Rouge to power, who forced most Cambodians to migrate into the countryside and massacred millions. And it also sparked the largest student protests in U.S. history. In protest at Kent State University, the Ohio National Guard killed 4 anti-war protesters. At Jackson State University, 2 students were killed by police. More than 350 colleges and universities had student strikes, and 21 campuses were occupied by troops. Simultaneously, troop morale dropped. Although all young men were subject to the draft, most college students received deferments. The Army was mostly composed of working-class whites and poor racial minorities. Blacks complained of having disproportionately higher casualty rates than white soldiers, and the military was not immune from domestic, social, and cultural changes. More and more soldiers wore peace and black power symbols, used drugs, refused orders, deserted, and assaulted and killed unpopular officers. The erosion in discipline convinced many high-ranking officers that the U.S. had to pull out from Vietnam. At the same time, public support for the war declined. Revelations in 1969 that U.S. forces had committed a massacre of some 350 civilians at My Lai the year before shocked the nation. In 1971, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, a classified government report that traced U.S. involvement in Vietnam back to World War II and showed how multiple presidents had misled the American public about it. The Supreme Court rejected Nixon's efforts to suppress the paper's publication. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which limited presidential authority by requiring congressional approval for troop commitments overseas. In 1973, Nixon sealed the Paris Peace Agreement and started to withdraw U.S. troops. The compromise left South Vietnam's government intact, but it also left North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops in control of parts of the South. U.S. bombing stopped and the draft ceased, but the North Vietnamese launched a final offensive in 1975 that toppled South Vietnam's government. The United States evacuated its embassy, and Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The Vietnam War was a military, political, and social disaster in which 58,000 Americans were killed, along with 3 to 4 million Vietnamese. The war cost the United States $100 billion, but the higher cost was to Americans' confidence in their own institutions and their nation's ideals and purposes. Policymakers behind the war, such as former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, have since said the war was a terrible mistake. Nixon's domestic and foreign policy successes secured his re-election in 1972. He won a landslide victory over liberal Democrat George McGovern and gained more support in Democratic strongholds in the South and among northern working-class whites. But triumph was succeeded by disaster. Nixon was obsessed with secrecy and did not tolerate differences of opinion. He viewed critics as national security threats and created an enemies list of unfriendly reporters, politicians, and celebrities. When the Pentagon Papers were published, Nixon established a special investigative unit in the White House known as the Plumbers to get information about Daniel Ellsberg, the former government official who had leaked the papers to the press. The Plumbers raided Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to discredit him. In June of 1972, 5 former employees of Nixon's re-election committee were caught breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C., and were arrested. The arrest did not affect the 1972 presidential campaign, but in 1973, the judge presiding over the prosecution of the Watergate 5 tried to find out who was behind the break-in. Washington Post journalists revealed that persons close to Nixon had ordered the Watergate operation and tried to cover up Nixon's involvement. Congressional hearings soon revealed a wider pattern of wiretapping, break-ins, and attempts to sabotage political opponents. A special prosecutor appointed reluctantly by Nixon demanded copies of tapes that the president had made of his conversations. The Supreme Court ordered Nixon to provide them, reaffirming that presidents are not above the law. The scandal unfolded for weeks, and by mid-1974, it was obvious that Nixon had at least ordered the cover-up of the Watergate break-in. It was really unclear whether he had ordered the break-in itself. In August of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend that Nixon be impeached for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Nixon soon became the only president to resign. His presidency is the classic example of the abuse of political power. In 1973, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned after it was revealed he took bribes from construction firms. Nixon's attorney general and 2 aides were convicted of obstructing justice in the Watergate affair and went to jail. Nixon insisted he did nothing wrong and that previous presidents also lied and conducted illegal activities. While not excusing Nixon, subsequent Senate hearings held by Frank Church of Idaho revealed a history of abusive actions by every Cold War-era president, including FBI, spying on millions of Americans and disruptions of civil rights groups, and CIA covert operations to overthrow foreign governments, assassinate foreign leaders, and organize a secret army in Laos, bordering Vietnam. The Church Committee revelations, along with Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, and the Vietnam War, seriously eroded Americans' confidence in their government. Congress soon placed restrictions on the FBI and CIA, which banned spying on American citizens and oversees covert operations without congressional knowledge. While liberals celebrated Nixon's downfall, they did not realize that liberalism itself, the idea that government can be trusted to take positive action to solve social problems and to promote the public good and individual freedom, was really damaged by these events. These events contributed greatly to a growing public belief that a powerful central government could not be trusted, and it distracted Americans from the looming economic crisis that shook America in the 1970s. Part 3. In the 1970s, post-war economic expansion and consumer prosperity ended, followed by slow growth and high inflation. The end of capitalism's golden age was caused by many factors. With a booming economy driven in part by a military-industrial complex, administrations had not realized how the Cold War might have less positive economic consequences. To check the Soviets, the United States had promoted the economic reconstruction of Germany and Japan and supported new manufacturing in places like South Korea and Taiwan. It encouraged American companies to invest overseas and didn't complain when allies protected their own industries while seeking unrestricted access to U.S. markets. Steel imports, for example, devastated the American steel industry, and the strong dollar tied to gold by the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement made it harder to sell goods overseas. In 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, the United States had a trade deficit, which meant they were importing more goods than they were exporting. By 1980, almost all goods produced in the United States were competing with foreign-made products, and the number of manufacturing workers had declined to 28%. It had been at 38% in 1960. The Vietnam War produced higher federal deficits and rising inflation. In 1971, Nixon announced a radical departure in economic policy. He took the United States off the gold standard, ending the Bretton Woods Agreement, which fixed the value of a dollar and currencies in gold. From now on, world currencies floated in relation to one another. Their worth determined not by treaty, but international currency markets. Nixon hoped this would promote U.S. exports, but the end of fixed currency rates destabilized the world economy. Nixon also froze wages and prices for 90 days to stabilize the economy. These policies briefly stopped inflation and reduced imports, but a war between Israel and its neighbors Egypt and Syria led Middle Eastern governments to hike the prices of oil and suspend oil exports to the United States for several months. By this point, the United States imported one-third of its oil. Congress lowered the speed limit and urged conservation to save fuel. The energy crisis focused public attention on domestic energy sources like oil, coal, and natural gas. Oil exploration increased in the American West, and the high oil prices set by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, benefited Western energy companies. But rising oil prices affected the global economy and contributed to the combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation known as stagflation. Between 1973 and 1981, the inflation rate in developed nations was 10% per year, while economic growth was down from the 1960s to 2.4% per year. The so-called misery index, the sum of unemployment and inflation rates, stood at 10.8 in 1970. By 1980, it was near 22. With higher oil prices, Americans bought more fuel-efficient foreign cars, hurting the domestic auto industry. The economic crisis helped erode the post-war social compact. Facing lower profits and more global competition, corporations eliminated more high-paying manufacturing jobs through automation and moving jobs overseas. Older industrial cities and areas were devastated, while smaller industrial cities suffered even more, and as their tax bases disappeared, so did public services. The higher flows of population, jobs, and investment to the non-union, low-wage Sunbelt states increased the political influence of this conservative region. Always a junior partner in the Democratic coalition, Labor found itself on the defensive in this era and has been so ever since. The declining power of unions and the continuing economic shift from manufacturing to service jobs adversely impacted ordinary Americans. While median family income had doubled between 1953 and 1973, real wages between 1973 and 1993 did not rise at all. The 1970s was one of only 2 decades in the 20th century when Americans were poorer than when it began. The economic crisis troubled Nixon's successors. Gerald Ford, appointed to replace Vice President Agnew, assumed the presidency when Nixon resigned. Ford named Nelson Rockefeller of New York as his vice president. For the first time in U.S. history, both offices were occupied by persons for whom no one had voted. One of Ford's first acts was to pardon Nixon, which prevented his prosecution for obstruction of justice. This was a deeply unpopular decision. Ford had no significant accomplishments in domestic policy. Ford and his economic advisor, Alan Greenspan, wanted Americans to spend less and save more to build money for investment, and they called for tax cuts and less government economic regulation. The Democratic majority in Congress did not approve. To fight inflation, Ford urged Americans to shop wisely, reducing spending and wear win buttons for whip inflation now. Though inflation fell, unemployment rose in 1975 to the highest level since the Depression. But Ford continued Nixon's policy of détente, and the United States signed an agreement with the Soviets at Helsinki, Finland, that recognized the permanence of the division of Europe. The Helsinki Accords inspired movements for more freedom in Eastern Europe's communist countries. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, a former Georgia governor unknown outside that state, ran as a Democratic candidate, untainted by a highly unpopular federal government. He won with a comfortable margin over Ford. A devout evangelical Baptist, Carter promised a disillusioned American electorate that he would be virtuous and honest. He wanted to make government more efficient, protect the environment, and morally improve politics. He also supported black aspirations, and he appointed unprecedented numbers of African Americans to federal office. Even though the Democrats controlled Congress, however, Carter and the Congress rarely cooperated. Seeing inflation and not unemployment as the main economic problem, proposed cuts in domestic programs, viewing competition as a way to reduce prices, he deregulated the trucking and airline industries and supported the Federal Reserve's policy of raising interest rates to reduce economic activity and thus wages and prices. He had hoped to stop inflation, but higher oil prices kept inflation alive. Carter also embraced nuclear power as a way to reduce dependence on foreign oil, but a near-fatal accident in 1979 at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania released radiation and sparked public fears about nuclear power and stopped the industry's expansion. Carter even repudiated his party's legacy as the party of affluence and economic growth when he gave a speech in 1979 about the nation's crisis of confidence, seeming to blame it on Americans themselves and their bankrupt definition of freedom as self-indulgence and consumption. Under Carter, a commitment to human rights defined U.S. foreign policy for the first time. Human rights groups in the 1970s that influenced Carter began to identify human rights violations not only by communist nations, but by U.S. allies as well, especially Latin American dictatorships that used death squads to kill political opponents. In 1978, Carter cut off aid to the military dictatorship in Argentina, which, in the name of anti-communism, had launched a dirty war against its own citizens, kidnapping and murdering 10,000 to 30,000 persons. As Argentina was an important U.S. ally, this shocked Latin American regimes dependent on American aid. By his presidency's end, Carter had made human rights central to American policy. He believed that in the post-Vietnam era, U.S. policy should move away from Cold War assumptions and instead combat Third World poverty, prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, and promote human rights. Carter also pardoned Vietnam-era draft resistors. Carter's emphasis on peaceful solutions to international problems brought some important results. In 1979, he brokered the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. He improved Latin American affairs by promising to transfer control of the Panama Canal in 2000. He resisted calls to intervene against the left-wing revolution fighting Somoza, Nicaragua's dictator. He also cut military aid to the right-wing government of El Salvador, which sponsored death squads. But despite criticisms from realists that his focus on human rights was damaging U.S. power in the world, Carter continued to pour billions into defense, and the United States continued to support allies with records of human rights violations, such as Guatemala, the Philippines, South Korea, and Iran. U.S. support for Iran undid Carter's policies and administrations. Iran, strategically located on the Soviet Union's southern border, was a major supplier of oil and importer of U.S. military equipment. Carter's 1977 visit in support of the Shah, Iran's ruler, inspired a more militant opposition, and in 1979, a popular revolution led by the Muslim cleric Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah and declared Iran an Islamic republic. The Iranian Revolution marked a shift in opposition movements in the Middle East from socialism to Arab nationalism to religious fundamentalism. This had long-term consequences for America. When Carter allowed the deposed Shah to come to America, Khomeini's followers invaded the U.S. Embassy and seized dozens of hostages. They regained their freedom only in January of 1981, the day Carter's term ended, and the hostage crisis deeply hurt Carter's popularity. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 by the Soviets, who sought to reinforce a friendly government fighting an Islamic rebellion, also confronted Carter with a crisis. Over time, the Soviet war in Afghanistan proved to be its own Vietnam, with high casualties, costs, and mounting domestic dissatisfaction. At first, however, it seemed to indicate a decline in U.S. power. In response, President Carter announced the Carter Doctrine, declaring the United States would use military force, if necessary, to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf. He retaliated against the Soviets with boycotts and withdrew from nuclear arms treaties. The United States also began to give arms and money to Islamic fundamentalists, rebels, in Afghanistan, giving rise to the Taliban.